Hey everybody, Gene here. Welcome to the Tapping Q&A podcast, where every single week we answer the most common and uncommon questions so you can get the most out of your tapping practice and eliminate self-sabotage along the way. Just as a reminder, we've been just making a real push this calendar year, getting ourselves to a place where we're adding 9 new people tapping a day. And that's not you finding 9 new people, but just as a community. If we were able to find 9 new people tapping a day, that would mean this calendar year we would have 3,000 new tappers. And if 3,000 people are tapping, they are healthier, their environment is healthier, the world is a better place. So if you know someone who hasn't experienced the podcast before, teach them how to listen to a podcast. There's still 2/3 of the population who don't know how to actually or don't regularly listen to a podcast. So if that means taking their phone, showing them how to subscribe, showing them how to download something like the Tapping Q&A app where all the podcasts are available for free, it will make it easier for them. And by making it easier for them to consume amazing content, we're making it easier for all of us to feel healthier as we continue to use this amazing tool. Thanks for your help in this. TappingQA.com has all of the information on how you can get the podcast on your Apple device, your Android device, in Spotify, in your Alexa, in Stitcher, and there are a couple more coming very soon. I can't wait to share those with you as well. So tell a friend, show them how to use a podcast.
Grief is the normal, natural reaction to disappointment and loss. So it's an innate response to the things that just don't go the way we pictured in our lives.
This is Gene Staley, and welcome to the Tapping Q&A podcast, recorded live to tape from Williamsburg and Brooklyn. This is episode 363, originally aired May 15th, 2019. Hi, everyone. I hope this finds you well wherever you are and whatever time of day you're getting a chance to listen to this. Thanks for spending some time with me today. Today, we're going to talk about grief, what grief is and what it isn't. And I think you're going to be very surprised by that particular answer, and how we can effectively use tapping for grief, and how we can effectively be present to those around us who are experiencing grief, because that's something that can just be a really tricky, difficult thing. If you haven't done so already, we have a free 10-part guide where we show you how you can use tapping to eliminate self-sabotage. There's audios, there's videos, there's tapping scripts, there's instructions. All you need to do is go to tappingqa.com, click on the big blue button. If you happen to be in the website right now, up in that right-hand column, you'll see a blue button there as well. And we will start getting you that free guide every single day over the course of the next 10 days. So you can use tapping in these little bitty ways every single day, which will make a huge difference for you. The other thing we need to do before we jump into the podcast is just issue some thanks and appreciation. Every single week, we have been thanking people all over the world who have been downloading the podcast this calendar year. I'd like to thank folks in Ecuador, Guatemala, Jersey, the country, not the state, New Jersey, Macedonia, Vietnam, and Chile. Thank you very much for being listeners to the show. And a very special thank to Susan and Shelley. They are 2 people who have decided to financially support the podcast. This means that we keep being able to produce this show, making it available far and wide. And we've now reached a level of support that we're going to start transcribing some of the past interviews, so you're going to have access to those as well. If you would like to support the podcast and receive a bunch of amazing bonuses, like bonus podcasts every single month, all you need to do is go to tappingqa.com/support. tappingqa.com/support, and you too can be like Shelley and Susan, supporting the show. So like I mentioned at the top of the show, today we have a conversation about grief. And the interview is with Lynne Staley. And I met Lynne a couple of months ago at the Spring Energy event and was just immediately connected with her approach and her disposition. And so there are a couple of things that I want you to pay really close attention to, in addition to this is how we tap for grief, because there's really great information about that. But what I want you to pay attention to is, number one, she has a lot of really great advice about how we show up to people who are experiencing grief. That for me, I spend a lot of time working with my clients and talking about the people in our lives who have well-meaning incompetence, where they want to do what is best for us. They just don't do it in the best way. And when we respond to grief, oftentimes that happens. And oftentimes when someone is grieving, we don't do anything because we don't want to say the wrong thing. And so Lynne has some really great advice on how we can be present to those experiencing grief. The second thing I want you to pay really close attention to is her definition and approach to grief, because the broadening of the definition is something that I think is really healthy and helpful, because I would be willing to bet there have been a number of times in your life where you've experienced a loss that's not a death, but a loss of some sort, have experienced grief and have brushed it off as no big deal. Well, I need to just be able to get over that. And that's not actually a healthy thing to do. And so we dive into in this interview places that we can identify grief. And then obviously, most importantly, in all of this, we talk about how you can specifically tap for grief in your own life and with those around you. This is something that you should listen to, even if you're not experiencing grief right now, because you are going to, at some point in your life, experience grief again. You are going to bump into people who you love who are going to be experiencing grief. And the more prepared you are now when that happens, the easier it is going to be for you to respond in a way that is useful. So here is my conversation with Lynne. Initially, how did you get connected or interested in grief and the process of grief and doing work in response to grief?
Well, I had a dear friend who was a colleague at work, and we were both youngsters. I had a young baby, and she also had a baby, and very unexpectedly and tragically, her 18-month-old daughter died. Mm-hmm. And we were both part of the development and communications department of a large social service agency in Chicago. And so completely thrown off by this, and like so many of us wanting to run in the other direction, I went to the head of our counseling agency. And I said, what do I do? I don't know how to respond to this. And she gave me the very best advice, and that was just show up, mm-hmm. because so many people won't. Yeah. And so I screwed up the courage I had, left my two little ones at home with my husband, and drove to be with Trish and her husband. And they comforted me. Mm-hmm. And we talked about their baby, and it was really the beginning of a deepening of our friendship. Mm-hmm. And so this story continues in that 9 years later, I got a phone call that my dear friend Trish, the mom of this baby, had died. Mm-hmm. And that's the one that absolutely knocked me off my feet. I had no idea how to respond to this. So I went to the library and Borders and pulled out every book I could on the subject of grief and loss. And I tripped over a book called The Grief Recovery Handbook. And even though I didn't care for the word recovery, I learned that the authors talked about it in terms of to regain a sense of well-being. And I thought, that's exactly what I want. I want to feel better about this, right, and I want to understand this. So that's when I became a student of the subject of grief and loss, is after the death of a dear friend.
Awesome. And so one of the things that I think is always really important when we're having conversations is, particularly about a topic that we're going to talk about really specifically, is that we have a common vocabulary. When you use the word grief, what do you specifically mean by grief?
That's such a good question. Grief, to me, is really the normal, natural reaction to disappointment and loss. So it's an innate response to the things that just don't go the way we pictured in our lives. So it's a very broad brush definition.
And the thing I love about that is I'm one that always thinks of our emotions as nothing more than just information that our system is giving us. And so they show up to give us a really specific piece of information. And, grief is the information of loss that then becomes our system saying, hey, there's something that is really, really important to us that we have lost and we need to pay attention to that thing.
Absolutely. And so people sometimes confuse grief with mourning.
Mm.
And mourning is going public with our grief. Mourning is sharing our grief with others. And because grief is the innate response to loss, everyone grieves. But not everyone mourns, which is this sharing, this talking about it, being able to express what the pain really feels like and what maybe the precious relationship that you're grieving.
Mm-hmm.
So people will say, I don't think I ever grieved my mother when she died.
Right.
And I think what they're trying to express is this idea of mourning. And that's what I think we've gotten away from in our culture, is this idea of mourning. We used to have this, the casket actually was in the parlor, in our home, and people came to us. And I think there are certain traditions that keep that alive, but it's pretty unusual in America for people to mourn that way. We've kind of turned it over to the professionals.
Yeah, I can, when my grandfather died, I can remember for 2 days watching my father and my uncle as they stood next to the casket in this small Italian town in Western Illinois and basically just held court for 2 days and served in a way, because my grandfather was a pillar of the community in a way that happens in small towns, and the way that they helped people to do that piece that you're talking about, that mourning piece, and it was really interesting, even though it was their father, they were the two people who were giving other people that opportunity to process the grief that they were having. And by getting a chance to do it with my grandfather's two sons, it was almost as if they were getting permission to do it in a way that they might not have otherwise, because they're doing it in such a specific way with people who were so close. And I love the fact that you've separated those two words.
That is so brilliant, because I think we've forgotten what the purpose is of those funeral events. It really is for other people, to support the family and to say, we are there for you. We are still around. And yet we've kind of switched it around. I mean, I've heard over and over people who create the visitation, the hour before the funeral, because we don't want to put anybody out.
Right.
And I want to say, no, this is the opportunity for the people in your life to show up. So there's an author that I really like. His name is Alan Wolfelt, from Center for Loss, I believe, in Colorado. And he writes brilliantly about funerals and the importance of them, and that idea that we support the family.
Yeah.
And that's really how I got into this line of work, was to be that supportive person, because I recognized how poorly we do that in our culture.
Absolutely.
We don't know how to show up. We think we have to say something profound. We have to do something tangible. And it really is about that eye-to-eye engagement, instead of some kind of expertise, or, I've got to think of the right thing to say, because then people stay away. And it gives grievers the impression that they have to do it on their own, that it's a solitary experience. And it's a time when we need each other, but we don't know how to show up in that way.
Yeah. And so before we start talking about the ways that we can care for ourselves and care for others in moments of grief, there's one other thing I wanted to talk about. And when you and I had a chance to work together at the Spring Energy event back in April, one of the things that I was really touched by and really impressed with in your presentation was the list of all of the things in which we grieve. That for most people, death is something that is obvious that we're going to feel grief. Some people are going to have a slightly more nuanced understanding of it. It's like grieving the loss of a relationship. Maybe it's a breakup or something like that. And what I thought was really interesting is how you expanded the definition of events that we grieve for to be so much bigger than just a couple of those really big things that we would immediately think of. So I would love to have you share a little bit about kind of why that list is bigger, what is on that list, why it's important for us to recognize grief in places beyond those big places.
Well, if we use this broad brush definition of grief, which is a natural reaction to things that don't go the way we pictured.
Yeah.
It really can be anything from something in childhood, like not making student council, to, the things that as an adult you recognize as, maybe a health diagnosis or job loss.
Yeah.
I work with a lot of people who have family estrangement in their story. But it really can be anything that throws us off in that way. And I think that's helpful to people. And to know that these are the kinds of things that it's worth talking about to someone.
Right.
When you have a diagnosis maybe for a child who when you're pregnant, you think all these beautiful thoughts about Little League and, going off to college, and those things are not possible any longer. And yet those are families maybe that don't understand this concept of grief and can't really understand how they're feeling and how off kilter the child is still in their lives.
Right.
And so I think it's really important to have this conversation about it. Really is anything where you have that reaction of, oh my gosh, I didn't picture it this way.
Yeah. And I think it's that, and the reason why I wanted to touch on that specifically is I think that's such an important point, to give ourselves permission to feel grief about things. Because oftentimes, the phrase I use a lot is well-meaning incompetence, where people show up in our life to be helpful, and their intent is, and they aren't necessarily. And so, if a relationship ends or we don't get a promotion or a job that we want, it's like, oh, there's more fish in the sea, or, oh, you'll have another opportunity. And that's well-meaning. Like they want us to be able to recognize that, yes, there are other opportunities in the world, and this isn't the end of that thing. But what it's doing is it's denying us, or it's putting a roadblock up in front of us to let us know that it's okay and it's appropriate to grieve the loss of this thing. And for me, fully articulated emotions are short-lived. Like when we give the emotion the opportunity to be heard, it's going to process through. When we don't, it's going to linger and it's going to show up in different ways. And so by being able to name, and there is a difference in the degrees of grief of me missing an opportunity this week and me losing a loved one. Like I'm not conflating the experience of grief as being the same for all of these different things. But by giving ourselves the permission to go, okay, I'm allowed to grieve this loss right now. And it's not even that I'm allowed to, I probably am grieving right now. And by acknowledging that, it's going to give me the opportunity to actually do some work around that to make sure I'm being healthy. So this isn't something that's hanging out for a really long time.
Well, I think you raised such a good point. We have almost this hierarchy of what's acceptable to feel deeply about. And so one of the rules when I do a group or when I work with someone one-to-one is no comparing losses.
Yeah.
Because your stuff is your stuff. And what you describe, this well-meaning response can feel insensitive. And if only they would add this piece of, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry that happened to you, or some kind of recognition. Otherwise, it almost feels like they're jumping over something to get to that, let's just get to the part where you wrap this up so that I don't feel so
Right.
uncomfortable with how
Yeah.
you're feeling right now. And so that's what I just, I talk about it as, let's sit in the puddle for a minute with each other.
Mm-hmm.
It might be the puddle
Yeah.
of tears. It might be a puddle of just messiness. But
Yeah.
that's the part that we're so uncomfortable with. And that what was when I made that choice was I want to be the person in the puddle with, that I wish I had.
Yeah.
Because I think you recognize in what you say that we jump to this well-meaning stuff. And there's a nickel's worth of truth in all that.
Absolutely.
That yes, you have another opportunity, or things will change over time. But it sounds different when somebody says it to you. You can say it for yourself, but it sounds
Right.
different when somebody's offering that up. It can feel insensitive.
Yeah. And so it sounds like the first step is, when we are managing something ourselves or when we are accompanying someone else, is just to acknowledge the fact that grief is happening, grief is appropriate, and it's what's supposed to be going on in this moment. It doesn't mean that we're going to live there forever, but it gives us the opportunity of just acknowledging it. When my sister, you're talking about sitting in the puddle, my sister, in December, had to put her dog down after more than a decade and a half. And we spent 2.5 hours just laying on the floor of my parents' basement crying. Like that. That's just basically what we did. Like, we weren't solving problems. We weren't doing anything else. Literally, we were just sitting in the middle of that and doing nothing more than sitting in the middle of that thing.
Perfect. Absolutely perfect.
So then, after we have named and recognized the fact that this is the experience that I'm having, and just letting ourselves feel it and to sit in it, or to sit with someone in that, what then are the tools that we reach for? What are the issues that are there that we can do transformation on, that we tap on? Like, not that we need to be moving on really, really quickly, but once we have done that grieving, like have felt it to the point where we're ready to start doing something else, what do the next couple of steps look like?
Well, there are a couple of things that come to mind sort of in that initial part, and that is tears are healthy and cleansing.
Yep.
And yet, how many times have you been with somebody who says, "Oh, I'm sorry, I'm crying"? They apologize for their tears.
Yeah.
So that's another piece of, the beginning work. I always have tissues, of course, but I don't hand them to people, because that can give the impression that what they're doing isn't appropriate.
Right. Clean yourself up.
Yeah, just that gesture of handing someone a box of Kleenex,
right,
gives that message of, oh, maybe I should stop this. So, people reach for their own tissues,
right.
And that can be part of the messiness. It's just not my job to tidy that up. And absolutely, this full expression. Sometimes when people are grieving the death of someone precious, they feel like they cannot honestly express, the good, the bad, and the ugly about what happened. And so then we have this, you can have this issue of enshrinement, where, someone's put up on a pedestal.
Yeah.
And yet I think it's really important that this expression kind of include all of that. And that's where it's helpful to be with someone you trust. One of the first explorations that I do with people, we start generally with a loss event inventory. So people really look at their own loss history, because it helps identify patterns of coping. It can really be encouraging too, to say, wow, look at what I've endured over time. But then when we look at things in a more focused way, because typically people walk through the door with someone in mind that they're mourning, the relationship, then we really encourage this looking at a holistic picture of that relationship. So all of the wonderful times that you had together. And then the things that didn't go well, or the annoying things, or, so that there's this picture of a whole person, so that we don't end up on either end where we're enshrining someone or bedeviling someone. But, at some point there's something good here, or at some point there were things that, maybe were uncomfortable, and let's be honest about all of that.
So I think one of the secondary benefits, I imagine, of doing a loss inventory like you talked about is I would be willing to bet there are times in which the disproportionate nature of the grief that they're feeling is because it's all of the unprocessed grief or unprocessed grief from previous loss experiences, where I'm in a circumstance where I lose something that normally I would grieve but would be much smaller. The grief is so much bigger because it's reminding me of all of the loss in the past. And you talked about the coping mechanisms. Well, sometimes the coping mechanism is just to stamp it all down so I don't have to deal with it in any particular way, which means that I had a functional tool in that moment, but it doesn't mean I've actually dealt with what I'm dealing with there. And by recognizing, oh, these are the other losses that this rhymes with. And oh, look at that. This is also coming up in this moment as well.
Absolutely. And the other thing that is such our human nature is to process things intellectually. Mm-hmm. So one of the interesting things in looking at a loss event inventory is how often we look at it and say, well, that's silly, because we're looking at it through an adult lens now and saying, why did that come up? And that's another benefit of doing this exercise. And anybody who is familiar with emotional freedom techniques would kind of liken this to the personal peace procedure.
Yeah.
But I really like this because it helps connect the dots related to disappointment and loss and, the things that just didn't go the way we pictured. Kind of maybe helps provide that focus and that connecting of the dots. It also allows for this conversation between intellect versus emotion. Mm-hmm. Why is this on here? That happened when I was in third grade.
Right.
But the fact that it's come up and become part of your mind's awareness is giving us good information. And so those, when I started employing EFT, those are brilliant tapping targets.
Absolutely.
And, I can, assess whether that's where we start or whether we start with the things that are more, right out front with a client. But it gives us so many doors to open to get at things. And from using this technique that something is going to shift.
Yeah. And it's interesting, as we've been going through all of these things and talking about, the resistance to the grief and how do I process the grief, and just going through the process that you're talking about and how we name it and we do inventory and all of that sort of stuff is a healthy way of doing all of this. And by adding the extra tool of tapping every single time we bump into a resistance, oh, I'm not allowed to feel that way. Well, that's a really great tappable moment. Or, boy, I have no idea why this is showing up. Or, I'm concerned I'm not going to process in the right way. Or, this isn't healthy for me. Or, I'm overreacting. All of those. The process you're talking about is we have the process of grief, then we have the tool set that we lay over top to process it. Then there's all of those emotions and judgments and resistances that show up as we walk through both of those things, that by adding tapping to that just gives us the ability, I'm sure, to move through that in a much smoother fashion.
Well, that's certainly what I think. Mm-hmm. And I also can put on my coaching hat and talk to people about developing a feelings vocabulary, because it is unusual for grown-ups to have a very extensive vocabulary about how they're feeling. Now, that doesn't mean they can't get in touch with that. And so I bring that to them in terms of a document that they can take a look at and just use it almost as a prompt So, gosh, I'm not sure exactly how I'm feeling right now. Let me look at all of these words. Oh, I think that what I'm feeling is fear or disappointment, or I'm kind of puzzled right now, or, it helps them with the language. They probably do know how they feel. They just don't really have the vocabulary always, or aren't in touch with the vocabulary to express it in the moment. And so that can be really helpful to help them start using it. Use this with your family, when you're making dinner. I'm really frustrated right now because this is the time when we agreed you would do your homework. Start using that vocabulary. You're going to have the benefit. If you have children, they're going to have the benefit of developing something too. So I think that's helpful. The other thing that I talk to clients about are thought habits. Because, I have worked with some clients over time, and even though we've cleaned up some of these things that have really heavy energy related to past events, they're creating, bringing some of these things back into their present experience because of how they think about things. Maybe they're a worrier. And so we talk about, let's just start to notice what's going on in the times that you're in thought. And I don't want you to judge it. I just want you to notice, start noticing. And then you'll notice, oh my gosh, there's that part of me that wants to worry, or there's that part of me that goes into fear. And that awareness, that's starting to notice, not judge, but starting to notice, can allow for the interception of that habit. And that's when you can create just new things going forward. And that's really the bottom line of what I'm about when I work with somebody who's grieving, is how do we create the now what?
And so, there's a couple of things I just wanted to dovetail off of that. The first was when it comes to the feelings and the emotion. The Center for Nonviolence Communication has an absolutely amazing feeling inventory that is absolutely free. I'll stick a link in the show notes for folks. But it's both positive, but it has both positive and negative emotions, and it organizes them where it gives you a primary emotion like anger, then it gives you 17 flavors of anger, so that you can do a better job of getting yourself clear on what those emotions are and how you're experiencing it. Like you said, because when we can talk about it clearly, then it gives us the opportunity to process it more effectively. And then the other thing I think that's really important that you identified there is that before every emotion we experience, there's a thought. Because we have the experience in our environment, we have a thought that is interpreting that, and then the emotion is response to that. And when we're feeling these big, deep emotions, we're the furthest possible space we can be away from hearing the thoughts that come before it. And so when we're able to, just as an individual, but certainly as a tapper, when we're able to recognize what the thought is, we can now evaluate the thought, which gives us this great fuel for us to tap on. Even though I think this is what is going on, I know this to be true. And when we're able to give both sides of the argument, I'm giving the side of the argument that is the interpretation from my subconscious mind. And then I give the side of the argument from my intellectual self that recognizes the fact that I'm not actually processing this correctly in the moment in that quick thought. And it just gives us this really beautiful tapping script where we can go back and forth between those things. My subconscious believes this, my intellect believes that. My subconscious believes this, and as we do that, we get an opportunity to reform the thought into the one that is most useful. And when the thought is useful, then the emotional response is more proportionate and it's more natural and it's not bigger. And we're going to move through it in a way that we don't stay stuck in it.
Beautifully said. Beautifully said. And there's it really is kind of an infinite list of things that we can tackle.
Yeah.
And that's what I love about, I guess I kind of see life through this lens of loss. And so when I'm working with a young person, I'm thinking about, they've already experienced disappointment, things that didn't go the way they wanted to. And so what I want for them is certainly to help them have the tools to clean any of that up and address it, look at it, but also to keep from storing things going forward. And that's what is so brilliant about EFT and why I'm kind of an evangelist about it.
And I think that's something that's really important inside of what you talked about there in working with young people. And this is for all of us. And you said this at the very beginning, that loss is never a competition. Our experience of loss is completely relative. And when we are younger, things that seem small to us as adults because our experience is so much wider, to someone who is younger really is the biggest deal in the world.
Well, because it's developmentally appropriate for them to be that self-focused. And they're looking around and thinking, this is only happening to me. I'm the only one who's, experiencing it this way, which is such the teenage mind.
Awesome. Well, Lynne, I really appreciate the time today. This was just such a perfect conversation.
Well, I've enjoyed it too.
I hope you enjoy that interview as much as I did. Lynne is just so thoughtful and deliberate and such an amazing vehicle for this message. If you'd like more information on Lynne and her great work and the resources she has created, all you need to do is go to tappingpodcast.com, click on link 363. That's tappingpodcast.com, link for the show 363, and you will be able to find all of Lynne's contact information and how you can get a bunch of her amazing resources. If you have a question or a comment or something you'd like to see us cover on the show in the future, please let me know. I have been working on a bunch of new interviews and a bunch of new topics over the course of the last few weeks. Many of them have come from people who are recommendations from listeners just like you. And I never would have found my way to those conversations if I wouldn't have gotten those recommendations. So I can be reached at Gene, Gene, at tappingqa.com. If you're in the website, just click on that contact link. If you are in the Tapping Q&A app, which is absolutely free, all you need to do is click on that contact link. You can send me an email or a voicemail message from right inside of that app. For the Tapping Q&A podcast, this is Gene Montrastelli. I hope you have a great day, and I will talk to you real soon. Bye-bye. The Tapping Q&A podcast is copyright Gene Montrastelli, Tapping Q&A 2016. All views expressed by guests are those of the guests and not necessarily of Gene Montrastelli or Tapping Q&A.